Cool. Hi everyone, welcome to Unit Masters live speaker sessions number 10. We're here with Michael Norman, currently in Austin. He's a serial entrepreneur and the founder of WeFunder. It's one of the leading platforms for democratizing investments. And yeah, I guess we run these speaker sessions where we talk to leaders and innovators and top entrepreneurs to share their insights and thoughts. Yeah, really excited and inspired to listen to Michael and his experiences and journey so far. So please put your hands together and welcome Michael. Thank you.
Great to be here, folks.
Awesome. So in terms of the format for today, so we'll start off with Michael sharing his hero's journey, so like how he got started and his background, his difficulties or high points or low points in his entrepreneurial journey, as well as his vision for the future. So Michael, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. So where did I get started? I guess, I've been kind of starting things my whole life in a sense. Prior to starting WeFunder, which is the last company that I founded another company, So Change, and prior to that, a youth program for kids from public housing developments, and prior to that, got off the first kind of public-private partnership initiative for corporate social responsibility in Costa Rica. So I tend to be attracted to doing things that can have what I perceive to be pretty high impact, right? I'm really excited about the idea of taking some, concept that doesn't really exist, that hasn't been, actualized into a product or an organization, and then going through all of the work of building all the pieces to actually, create whatever impact that idea could potentially have in the world. And I've done that, obviously, as I mentioned, on the nonprofit side, and then also in tech and on the for-profit side as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess, the drive for me really comes from this concept of impact and meaning, right? Like for me, my meaning in my life is very closely tied to the impact that I am able to make through the things that I'm doing. And if it feels like the things that I'm doing are not super impactful, honestly, from kind of a pretty broad for a pretty broad segment of the humanity, in a sense, then I tend to not feel terribly fulfilled, and so that's why I've been drawn to the different initiatives that I have been in the past.
Awesome. And how did you get started in terms of like your background? Like where were you born, and like have you always
Yeah. It's a great question. So I was born in Providence, Rhode Island. Wound up going to Northeastern University in Boston for my undergrad. I was a competitive kickboxer while I was there, part of the kind of U.S. national team, which was a great experience. And then moved to Costa Rica after that and worked on the corporate social responsibility public-private partnership project that I just mentioned. So I did that for a couple of years. Then I came back to the States. I wound up starting a youth program for kids from public housing developments in Boston, and then went to grad school. I was really interested in this idea of what could a different framework for the relationship between kind of business and its stakeholders, be they the employees or the communities where the businesses were located, look like. So in my time in Costa Rica, I had really been exposed to the power that business can have to make a positive impact on the world. And I wanted to see how we could put structures together that would incentivize that even more. So I wound up going to grad school at MIT for city planning with a focus on community economic development, which was to say that was the place I thought I was going to have the best opportunity to learn what some of those modalities might look like for kind of incentivizing businesses to be better corporate citizens. And kind of quickly learned over the course of a year that while the topical areas were very interesting, I was not going to be able to have the scale of impact that I really did want to have doing any of the jobs that kind of community economic development planners wound up taking. So I kind of of, put together a quick application in the business school, because I was basically like, all right, I need to either, start a large company that from the ground up is interacting with its stakeholders differently, or I need to build some type of platform which is going to exert a new kind of power on companies to convince them to, be better corporate citizens. Neither of these things I knew anything about. So I wound up going to the business school as well at MIT Sloan, was there for 2 years getting my MBA. And in the process, wound up founding my first company called SoChange, which was really a platform to try to aggregate consumer buying power, to basically use it as a carrot to convince companies to be, better corporate citizens. So I went through that process, which for a variety of reasons we can talk about if it's of interest, didn't work out. And then kind of taking the same community aggregate economic impact concept, but moving it to the investment side, founded WeFunder shortly thereafter, and was there for 6 years. So I stepped back from WeFunder a couple of years ago. I now run learning and development for Automatic, the company that owns WordPress.com and WooCommerce, Jetpack, Tumblr. And that is the quick sprint start story for me, getting us up to current day.
Amazing. And could you maybe share some of your process in terms of running SoCal or WeFunder, and I guess more recently in terms of your current project?
So process. I think when I started SoChange, one of the challenges was I didn't have any process, right? I had no idea what I was doing, right? I'd never kind of built a company before. I was pretty new in terms of my exposure to tech. And so I was having to learn all of these things for the first time, right? I didn't have any intuition about what kind of, product direction was going to be actually usable by people. I could come up with rational justifications and reasons why certain things should work. But I remember at one point I was like, oh, this is when people thought QR codes were going to be a thing. And I was like, yeah, we'll just load a QR code up in this app, and then people will scan it when they go into stores. And this seemed plausible to me at the time. But of course, as hundreds of other apps discovered at the time, that was not a user behavior that was gonna materialize in a consistent way. So, I think when I think about process for an individual or an entrepreneur, for a company, I really think about a kind of a feedback loop that you need to go through, and you want to be as disciplined as possible about iterating through, right? Which is to say, you come up with a number of assumptions about the world, and that can be assumptions about the size of a market. It could be assumptions about user behavior. It could be assumptions about, staffing and hiring, whatever it is. And then you want to go through a process of getting feedback to either verify or challenge those assumptions as quickly as possible, and then come back and go through that loop as many times and as quickly as you can. And that, I think, is ultimately what's going to differentiate successful individuals and successful companies, is how disciplined can they be about going through that learning loop and identifying kind of the areas where, the data may suggest that you need to update some of your assumptions, but that it doesn't naturally always happen automatically, right? We know that this happens in our brains, where you can get data back to ostensibly tell you that you need to update your mental model around how things function, but it does not naturally necessarily follow that occurs. So, in large respect, that's what I think about for myself when I'm choosing to work on things, and the way that I structure my own learning process, and what I'm primarily responsible for helping, Automatic put into place in a more structured way, broadly. And a lot of that, and a lot of my interest in actually taking this position, came from seeing that learning loop break down oftentimes in startups. So for folks that aren't familiar, WeFunder obviously is the largest regulation crowdfunding platform out there, allowing non-accredited investors to invest in startups. But we also did, for a significant amount of time between helping pass the legislation, the law in 2012, and then when those regulations actually went into effect in 2016, was run kind of like a venture capital firm in a sense, where the LPs were sourced through the internet. And so we would raise funds through the website, and I would invest them like any venture capital firm would in startups over the course of that period of time. And so I had a chance to, invest in Zenefits in their first round and see that whole kind of roller coaster, Ginkgo Bioworks, Checker, Goldbelly, and then, dozens of other companies as well. And so, as an investor, Michael, you'll know this, you get pretty broad exposure to see, kind of what are these processes and learning loops that the companies tend to go through. And in startups, time is so valuable, right? Like you have a certain amount of runway if you've raised some funding, where you really need to solve a core set of challenges to either reach profitability or raise your next round of financing. And what I would often see is, entrepreneurs, they come out with this set of assumptions about the world, about a market, about a problem that they want to solve. They hire a bunch of people based upon this vision. They, raise a bunch of money based upon it as well. And you need to have those skills. You need to have that kind of reality distortion field around you as a founder, where you're able to sell folks on something which is still just an idea and hasn't materialized. Now, I find that there is a challenging kind of area where you build a product, you're going to market with it, and you're getting data back, which is oftentimes going to disprove some of those assumptions that you kind of built the company, hired the team, and recruited investors on. And sometimes you'll see data coming back in where the data's there, the right tests have been run, but the assumptions aren't necessarily being updated to reflect that, right? Like the hard decisions aren't being made to say, should we go through a pivot? Do we need to do something else? Do we need to kind of, update our expectations about how big a certain kind of product can get? And I find that the teams that are most effective are able to be disciplined about doing that and are able to go through that process as quickly as possible of collecting data, reevaluating assumptions, and then moving forward. So if there's one process that I would say is crucial, be it for you as an individual or as a founder of a new company, it's that learning process and being really honest with yourself, which is tricky, right? Because you have to also be in this kind of evangelism sales mode to get people to buy into what you're doing, and at the same time, hold this space for really honest reflection about kind of how things are progressing.
Amazing. Could you give an example of that? Like
an example of
like an example process in terms of testing assumptions and
yeah. So, I mean, I think with anything, this is something that I often give advice to founders that are applying to, Y Combinator for, is that you'll come in, by definition, you're generally a pretty early stage company, and you're pretty smart, and you're going to have a well-defined, market that you're going after, products, so on and so forth. And what the partners, and I think oftentimes investors in general, are looking for is evidence that you're willing to go through this kind of cycle of looking for real world evidence, right? So, something at WeFunder that took a long time to figure out was, okay, we have, like one of the things that we did in the early days that I was sure was going to work, but it definitely didn't work, was okay, we've been able to get on the supply side a set of really high quality companies, Zenefits, Goldbelly, like companies that other venture capitalists were chomping at the bit to get into. I was able to convince them to secure a certain percentage of their round for us to offer to investors on the platform, right? So I had the supply side solved. Now I had to go find the demand side. And, as anyone who's in venture knows, that the hardest problem to solve is this kind of like deal flow supply side problem. And so I was basically like, I'm going to go out to all these people that don't have access to good deal flow, can't get into companies, and this is going to be kind of like a snap of the fingers. I'm going to be able to get these rounds oversubscribed as soon as possible. And so, okay, how do you find people that should be ostensibly interested in this kind of a thing, that don't have access to good deal flow? I was able to figure out in this point in time, you could kind of hack LinkedIn in a certain kind of a way to get people's email addresses from the information that you had on the platform. So basically, I was looking for venture-backed companies, folks that had job titles that indicated that they were making in excess of $200,000 a year. And then I had this nice form email that would reach out and be like, hey, look, you have some topical experience in these sectors, and I've basically sourced for you one of the most exciting companies coming out of the Valley right now, and you can invest as little as $1,000, right? This is not a meaningful amount of money necessarily, or a hugely meaningful amount of money for someone at that salary level. And my mental model of the world said that this was going to be just like an avalanche of investors coming in, right? And it didn't materialize, right? We had a trickle of investor interests, and but it was nowhere near what I expected to have happen, right? So I had this mental model of the world, which was that there are all these people out there that if they only had access to deal flow, were going to chomp at the bit to get in, and then I had solved the deal flow problem for them. Now, it turns out that's not the case. It turns out that I had, at that point, a relatively unsophisticated understanding of that kind of investor or how widespread the use case that I was expecting to materialize was going to be. It turns out that investing in startups, almost especially for people that are really smart, is a stressful thing. There's so many variables that you don't understand, right? There's so many things that could go wrong unless you're someone that has a very high risk profile, or someone who is deeply immersed in the startup ecosystem to have done enough pattern matching to feel some level of confidence that on minimal data, you're going to be able to kind of pick something that you think is going to be successful. Then it's actually not that huge of an audience of people that want to do that. So we had to update our model of what that was going to look like, and that meant slightly slower growth and so on and so forth. Now, the good thing about it was that we were learning these lessons kind of in preparation for the big change that was going to happen for us when we became a broad-based regulation crowdfunding platform where anyone could invest. And so that changed the kind of thesis a little bit. Whereas for the initial accredited investor venture capital model, we were looking for folks that were primarily, interested in investing in deal flow that they didn't have access to. Once we switched over to becoming a broad-based platform, companies were able to bring along, a large cadre of users or customers that were already familiar with what they were doing, that had enough kind of knowledge and enough context about the business to feel more comfortable making an investment. Because they were making not only a financial investment, but they were getting ownership in something that a product or a company or a founder that they were already excited about, which is just a very different use case than someone who's out there just looking to invest in startups and needs to find the next hot thing that they're going to get excited about. There are far more people that are willing to invest in a company that they're familiar with and have context about than there are people that are out there just looking for something exciting that they can go take a flyer on and buy a lottery ticket for. So that's just one example of a learning loop that we went through at WeFunder that wound up informing the long-term progress of the company.
Amazing. And a question from Sasha is, what was your happiest moment in your WeFunder journey?
Oh, I don't know if there is a happiest moment per se. I think in any company, there's just so many peaks and valleys. It's this real roller coaster of highs and lows. One of the happiest moments was actually getting the law changed, right? Going through this unexpected, process where my co-founder and I put together a petition to try to influence some legislation that was working its way through Congress. And then because of the way that the petition was built, it wound up getting a lot of attention in the media. So we became these kind of credible advisors to the senators and Congress people that were working on it. And over the course of 3 months, we're able to meaningfully change the legislation. And I was actually in the Rose Garden when President Obama signed it into law. So that was a real exciting moment. There are also, kind of by virtue of a regulated business, there wind up being these inflection points when the regulation goes into effect or the rules written by the governing body, the folks that define the way the business can operate shift. So we also had an opportunity in 2013 when some new rules came into effect to really kind of go through an inflection point in the business. And I basically kind of went down after Y Combinator's demo day, or right before Y Combinator's demo day, for a period, and convinced, I think it was like 16 or so companies to go live on the platform with this unproven regulatory structure, right? So it was a super exciting time where everyone was kind of like rowing in the same direction. I was out there selling companies. We had a new employee that was back kind of writing the profiles. I was coming back at night to help him kind of iterate on copy and learn how to do design. My co-founder was working on the profiles, and so there were these like really engaging moments where everyone has a focused goal, which is a specific deadline that everyone knows is super meaningful and important. Everyone's roles are very clear, and we wound up kind of like hitting the the goal that we had set, actually in going above and beyond. And then a similar period happened in 2016 when the regulation crowdfunding rules went into place, where we had a similar kind of company-wide, sprint. We'd been waiting for this to happen for 4 years almost at that point, and so there was a lot of build-up for that to happen, and we wound up kind of again beating our goal of the number of companies that we wanted to have live. So those are probably the 3 most exciting points in my tenure at WeFunder. Yeah.
Awesome. And what were the biggest challenges you faced in SoChange and WeFunder?
So SoChange, the biggest challenge, I think, was just fundamentally not understanding consumer behavior around the application that I wanted to build. So at SoChange, I came in with a far too optimistic view of how much friction people are willing to get past in order to send a message to companies that they want them to be better corporate citizens, right? Either by supporting them or being very clear that they are not, purchasing things from their businesses because they want them to change some type of environmental policy or labor policy, social policy, whatever the particular policy was. And I think my assumption was that if I make this easy enough, if I make people feel like they actually have a voice, such that the message is being sent clearly to the business owner that I'm voting with my dollars, and instead of me just doing that to feel self-righteous, I'm actually doing that in a way that sends a clear message to you as the business owner around how I feel about your corporate decisions. I thought that if I could fix that problem, that again, there would be lots of people that would be excited to participate. But I think the answer is that is not true, right? Is that it has to be relatively easy, really easy, and it has to be kind of similarly priced for folks to make big changes in their behavior for some type of ethical or moral reason. And that was the core challenge at SoChange. That, along with the fact that I had no idea what I was doing in terms of building products or any of these things. I want to make one point here. So one of the interesting things, I think, one of the more consistent things you hear when you talk to very successful entrepreneurs, and people always ask, what changed? What do you wish you had known then, or what do you do differently now that you didn't do beforehand? And almost always people are like, oh, I trust my intuition more now, right? Like, and I think that sometimes that can be misinterpreted as saying they always had that intuition and they just trust it more now. But you have to go through, the messy process of like getting things wrong and screwing up and having no idea what you're doing to be able to develop an intuition which should be trusted, right? And so I see SoChange as very much, me going through a variety of areas where I was having to learn what works and what doesn't, just generally from making mistakes. With WeFunder, and Michael, can you remind me of the question? What was the most difficult time?
What was the biggest challenge you faced from January?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge at WeFunder was it was a lot of waiting, So oftentimes, or not oftentimes, usually if you're in a company with in a non-regulated industry that doesn't have some date on the calendar where things are going to change, you can't live in the future. You can't. It's harder for you to say, oh, when this thing changes a year from now, then the whole dynamic is going to shift and our business is going to change. And so you have to confront reality as it is in front of you. Like, what do your growth numbers look like? What do the retention numbers look like? There's no kind of thing on the horizon that could potentially save you, right? In a sense. I think one of the most challenging things for us at WeFunder was how to balance the reality that we were going to see these regulatory changes at several inflection points in the company's trajectory that would change things without kind of, underweighting the reality of some of the metrics that we were seeing, in the day-to-day of the business, prior to those regulatory changes happening. So you had to draw this balance of both knowing that the future was going to be different and not wanting to be kind of naive in terms of how much change you thought that was going to make to the numbers and the business dynamic that was currently playing out. and then also kind of like make the changes that needed to happen in the day to day to make those incremental improvements to, you know, try to impact the important metrics. And I think that's actually really challenging, because there is a tendency, especially if the vision was around this big thing that hasn't been able to be put in place yet, you can get very attached to this future state where everything's going to change and it's going to be a whole new world, and that can take you away from focusing on the day-to-day kind of pieces. So that was probably the kind of big picture most challenging thing about WeFunder that is not going to be super relevant, likely for most entrepreneurs that aren't in those types of regulated industries. But I do think that there's a lesson there to be learned around kind of like, you know, the long term versus the immediate problem solving and thinking and orientation. And you have to be able to balance both and hold both in the right relationship to be successful.
Amazing. And we have a question here. What's the most difficult challenge you're solving right now, professional, personal, and how are you navigating through it?
Great question. So I'll start on the personal side. I think that the pandemic has been really challenging for me. I'm not someone that does well being as isolated as I have been. I'm a pretty social, extroverted person, and I haven't had a lot of those interactions over the past 9 months at all. So that's been really challenging for me. I think it's been important, and it's actually one of the pieces of advice that I would give to my younger self, and I think other entrepreneurs, is really finding the self-care practices that work for you, right? Be it meditation, exercise. Like, you need to form the habits of kind of self-care and regeneration, so you're going to have the creative energy to be able to think through hard problems and come up with innovative solutions. You need to figure that out when things are going pretty well, right? You don't want to wait until you're in a crisis to then have to figure out what the solution to that crisis is going to be. You want to have that safety net in place before anything goes sideways. And so for me, it has been really important to be able to like exercise regularly. I've started playing tennis super regularly. So it's like a safe kind of socially distanced activity. I get some type of social interaction with folks. And that kind of is for me a stimulating type of a thing. So that's a big important piece for me. And so I guess the next part of the question was, what's professionally my biggest challenge? So this is the first time that I've worked in a larger company, right? We've got about 1,300 employees at Automatic. It's also the first time that I have been in a exclusively internally facing role, where I'm not, you know, ostensibly the boss, right? So there are a lot of challenges that go along with kind of adjusting to that new context, where, you know, it's not like I come up with an idea for a policy and it just gets put into place, right? Like, I don't have the positional kind of authority to move things as quickly as I would like. And so, you know, it's been kind of a mental model of shifting to thinking about, you know, the employees that we're serving and the processes, the people that I want to adopt the processes that we're designing as kind of, you know, potential customers, as if we were our own startup as the learning and development team. And, you know, we have to convince these customers to do something, which has been really great. I'm kind of working on a different way for us to organize work and roles and responsibilities. I think is going to be incredibly helpful for the company, that we're calling hats. And one of the nice things is to be able to see this kind of like product market fit thing happening, but internal to a company, not as a startup dealing with external customers, right? So you'll hear people that I've never even spoken to are starting to use the language of hats, and they're starting to like describe this concept without it having to be imposed on them in any type of hierarchical manner. It's really interesting to see that play out internal to a company in a very similar way to how it might play out as a startup getting its early adopters and really trying to grow its user base. So, yeah.
Amazing. And I guess the company is super pioneering in terms of what, like, forward thinking and cutting edge. I'd love to hear more about that. I guess before we get that, Yep has a question: what makes a good corporate citizen?
What makes a good corporate citizen? I think, well, the way that I thought about that for SoChange is that that's defined by its stakeholders, right? People are going to care about different things. People are going to be more concerned with different issues. So I think a good corporate citizen, in my mind, is someone who's actually just listening to those, the issues that their communities where they're located care about, where their employees care about, it's going to be impossible for a corporation to be perfect on every single issue, and I don't expect them to be, but I do think it's important that they like exhibit some effort of trying to kind of pay attention to the things that their stakeholders in general care about. Now, that being said, our 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 economic and political system isn't really set up to require that, right? Like, your obligation, fiduciary responsibility is supposed to be to your shareholders, and that's what you're supposed to do. Build better products, make more money, and then government will put policy and regulations around to constrain your actions. And so the whole idea behind SoChange is, could you have some type of like far more impactful market mechanism to convince companies to be better and more responsive to customer desires for improved corporate stewardship and ethics that didn't exist at the time, right? We have this concept of the invisible hand, right? That like the market just kind of takes care of what it is that people want. But where that doesn't work is when there's kind of a whole bunch of competing kind of desires that are happening. And specifically as an individual, if you don't feel like voting with your dollars by not buying something is actually communicated to the company that you're choosing to not buy from, or if you're willing to pay a little bit of extra money or go out of your way to buy something because it represents some type of environmental or social value that you care about, if that message isn't being sent clearly to the people that are making decisions and within the company, then it's the most disempowering experience you can have, right? It's like voting and having your vote not counted. So that was what the dynamic that I was trying to solve at SoChange. And I think ideally that is the way that you want to kind of encourage better corporate stewardship.
Amazing. What's your dream or vision for the economy to look like, and what does that look like or feel like, and what's the experience like if it was optimal?
That's tough. So I'm not actually sure if I have thought enough about what an optimal kind of like new economy would look like to have a strong answer there. I do think that we're in this kind of like odd time right now where we have, a lot is changing in good ways, and a lot of, I would say, kind of companies are trying to figure out how to exist in this new world, right? And so you've got, Brian Armstrong at Coinbase being very clear about, hey, look, we're not going to take on any of that stuff. And if you're someone that cares enough about those issues, then you can feel free to not work here anymore. We would totally understand. But our impact is going to be seen through or realized through the products that we make and the customers that we impact. And I think that that's, reasonable. It dodges a lot of issues. It makes it far simpler as a management team to be able to kind of, define your priorities and the things that you're taking under consideration. I do think that there are, places where things do get missed without having kind of a stronger kind of corporate stewardship aim by a business. But at the end of the day, I think it's tricky to put this all on the companies, right? At the end of the day, if people cared enough about these issues to shift their buying behavior as a result, this problem would take care of itself. But that doesn't happen. And so, either you need to vote politicians into office that are going to put more stringent regulations on companies and define the playing field a little bit more narrowly, or you need to, try to change your buying behavior. I'm a big believer in personal agency, right? So I think there can be a predisposition of folks to say these other people need to do these things because that's what's right, or so on and so forth, rather than saying, what can I do as an individual to, make some type of contribution to the future that I want to build. And so I'm a big advocate for that. So this isn't really answering their question because, Michael, I think it's a very complicated question, and I am generally dissatisfied with, I think, a lot of the utopian answers that folks give around how economies should function, because the reality is it's messy, it's hard, and there are real consequences that go along with, a lot of the regulations that folks would want to incur, especially when you're competing on a global scale where, there are going to be other countries that aren't going to have any of those like requirements and restrictions, right? And so what do you do if you're California and you get super righteous about, your tax rate and your environmental regulations and the cost of doing business? At a certain point, you hit a threshold, people start leaving. And we're seeing that happen right now. And now your tax base is starting to dwindle. And now you don't actually even have the money to be able to pay for the social services that you want to be able to provide for folks, right? The goals are laudable, but it has to exist within, some context of, individuals making decisions about what they're willing to bear. And that's tricky. So I don't have any magic silver bullet answers to that question, unfortunately. Wish that I did.
That's awesome. A question from you. How does the experience compare with being an employee versus being a CEO, and what is the upsides for not being the CEO?
I mean, it's just far less stress and pressure, right? If you're running if you've got 2 months of runway and you're constantly kind of trying to raise funds or figure out a way to make sure that your people stay employed, you're under a constant level of a constant rate of mid-level stress, right? And that can last for years, and that takes a real toll on you. Obviously, the upside is that you're able to, build the team and the dynamic and the product exactly to, the vision that you want to see in the world. You have a tremendous amount of agency and control and ability to impact things, and you get to test out your own ideas, and that's awesome. Which is not the same thing when you're internal as an employee. Obviously, everyone has some domain of impact and agency, and you're hired to do a specific thing within which you have a tremendous amount of latitude. For me, being a founder is so stimulating and exhilarating because you have your hands in everything, right? You need to understand so many systems and so many overlapping systems in terms of like organizational process and incentives internally, and then sales and marketing and product. And for me, each one of those separate domains is its own invigorating stimulation. Whereas if you're working as an employee within a company, generally it's a little bit more narrowly scoped in terms of the type of things that you're working on.
Amazing. And how was your experience in Costa Rica in terms of shaping your perspective, and like curious how you developed this worldview in terms of wanting to do more than like deliver shareholder returns, or like caring for people, or sort of the more.
Yeah. Costa Rica was super valuable for me. Not only kind of, I think, living in a different cultural context, and realizing, how much more American my Latino American friends were than they were, Latino in a sense, right? Like how much of a strong culture America has, regardless of the differences that there are between us. I do think in Costa Rica, again, prior to that, my entire work or professional experience had been in the nonprofit sector. I did start to notice kind of some ways in which things were moving really slow, or there wasn't perhaps the same level of focus on results when your funding stream is not there's just a nice thing about capitalism, which is like you actually need to serve your customers well or you will die, right? So like if you're not giving customers something that they're willing to pay for, you're going to run out of money, you're not going to exist. That doesn't happen in nonprofits. You can, if you're great at being charismatic and painting a vision and that you stand for something important, you can plug along raising money from donors without necessarily making much of an impact for a long time. So there's a decoupling of the kind of, funding source from, the beneficiaries of the product, which I, started to learn is not a dynamic that I necessarily wanted to be in the middle of. So that was something that I learned there. Again, like I mentioned, prior to Costa Rica, it had been all nonprofit work for me. So I actually started to learn more about the impact that business could make on social issues when properly incentivized in Costa Rica. That's where I started to see, okay, if you can help a business brand themselves as this kind of, eco-friendly destination, now there is a profit incentive for them to do a bunch of things that they wouldn't do otherwise. And it turns out there is a market of consumers that are willing to pay more money to go to a place that does all these different things. And that was kind of a light for me that I hadn't realized beforehand, in terms of a lever that could be pulled to impact the causes that I cared about. And the whole job of the CSR nonprofit down there was to figure those things out and document them and put some structure around it. So that was probably the biggest impact on my thinking that happened at that time.
Amazing. And a question here from you. In terms of democratizing access and decentralizing like access to funding and self-agency empowerment, what do you think needs to happen in terms of technology or financial systems to see the next societal evolution or disruption?
That is a big question. So I think actually we're getting a pretty long way there in terms of decentralizing access to a lot of these things. I think that, crowdfunding legislation helps, just the very existence of software and the fact that it's so easy to teach yourself how to write code, and that anyone can kind of, not anyone, but folks that have access to the internet can go online and start to basically learn how to do these things themselves. The barriers to entry have dropped so much, at least to become a founder of a software company. And I think that's tremendously heartening. And then it's just a matter of kind of like, some of those barriers exist for a reason, right? So like VCs ultimately, they're not going to take intros. They're not going to take blind reach out cold calls, right? There's so many people that are out there looking for funding. Generally, they're going to want a referral that comes from someone that they know in their network. And that's partially has the impact of making it more of an old boys club, right? Where it is harder to break into how things are. But it's also a test for you as an entrepreneur, right? It's like you're going to need to be able to sell probably for most products. And you're going to, if you can't convince someone that has a relationship with that person to make an intro for you, then like that is a skill that you probably want to work on. And so on the agency side, there is this kind of like access to capital, and there are these structural and institutional barriers that make it harder for certain populations, and that's true. And part of being a successful entrepreneur, almost by definition, is breaking down barriers, right? Breaking down barriers within your industry, breaking down barriers, for the particular product that you want to use for your users. And so there's going to be a fair amount of that you're going to have to do, as an entrepreneur. And I don't think that's going to change necessarily, right? There needs to be some signal around your ability to do that, right? Yeah.
Amazing. We have a question from Matthias. Is there an experience which you felt like you never want to do again, like a mistake you did on your path, and how did you kind of overcome it?
It's tough, right? Because I feel like you learn from your mistakes, so it's almost like I don't want to repeat any of my mistakes again because they are mistakes. But I've learned from them, and I think that's really important. I do think, and again, when I come back to this learning loop, I think there are definitely places, and why I spend so much time both working on this internal to automatic and thinking about it in general, is that most of those mistakes have come from these, cognitive biases that like have perhaps prevented me from seeing reality clearly for longer than it should have. And so I really would go back to this process, and that can be a number of different things, right? Because it could be, having an assumption about user behavior that was wound up not being true and took me a little bit too long to fully integrate and, into my model of how our business was going to work, or it could be in many cases relationships, right? Where it's like, okay, this works in a certain respect, but it's really not healthy in another respect. And I'm going to avoid dealing with that, for too long. And that winds up being wasted time where you're like not being as effective, not being as excited as you could be because you've got this emotional drain on you from, the quality of the relationships that you're in. One of the interesting things that I've thought about and kind of changed my thinking about recently as I've gotten into my wizened old age, is in order to build a successful company, you have to have a good idea and you have to have the right team around you. And as kind of an entrepreneur, I think I've tended to default to thinking about the idea part as the most important component of success and my own personal happiness. I've started to shift my perspective on that. I actually think it's harder relatively to find people that I really want to spend a ton of time with, like every day, that'll be equivalent to professional marriages, who are also effective, who also have ethics that I know that I can trust, and who I'm willing to invest the next whatever it is 5 to 10 years of my life into. That is a harder thing to find than finding a plausibly good idea that warrants trying to figure out. And so that's a subtle, but I think meaningful lens shift around where to start in what you're looking for. Because also, if you find those right people that stimulate you in that kind of a way where 1+1 = 3, whose ethics you trust, the chances are you're going to come up with great ideas together just because of the nature of the collaboration and the dynamic between you. So that might be the non-obvious kind of thing that I would counsel folks that either are very, very early on something or haven't started something yet. It's spend the time, be patient, find the people that you want to work with, at least one first, before you kind of like fully commit to something and then start trying to sell people on it. Now, there's obviously a benefit of having made some progress on something and showing and proving that you can execute in order to like recruit people to work with you. And would never kind of recommend that you not do that. But I do think that people undervalue, especially when you're excited and getting something off the ground, the fact that you're going to be working with these people for 5 to 10 years. And you better figure out like that dynamic early on, or it's going to be uncomfortable.
Another question from John. In your experience, is there any process or consideration in selecting a suitable co-founder or business partner?
Yeah, like, do you like working with them? How does it feel, right? I think especially as younger, newer entrepreneurs, the focus winds up being completely on kind of technical skills. You're like, I'm super technical, so I need someone that can sell. This person can sell. They're a proven salesperson. Great. Together we'll conquer the world. Or, on the other side, right? Like I can go out and market and talk and sell. I just need someone who's technically strong. And at least in my past, I think I paid less attention to the texture of the dynamic in the relationship. And I think you should be more than willing to make some compromises on technical skill for a dynamic that feels good, right? Where it's exciting to work with this person and, it feels, generative when you're having ideas and discussions and brainstorming together rather than kind of like conflict. There's always going to be ups and downs and bumps in any relationship. But, if you take that, kind of 1+1 = 3 in terms of your energetic state when you're working with someone, you extrapolate that over the course of an entire startup's lifetime, 5-10 years, it's hard to under or overestimate how important of a factor that is to determine, to think of.
Amazing. A question from Carl. With companies, are they motivated purely by boosting their brand image, or what are their sources of motivations and benefits for like the social benefit aspect, like CSR, corporate social?
I think it depends, right? It depends on the size of the company, right? I think lots of smaller companies, it's because the founder has a certain ethics and a certain, predisposition to care about things. And so that winds up being a lot of what impacts the decision making. As you start to get to larger, corporates with formal boards and things like that, where there is a little bit more of a structure towards pure kind of like business profit thinking, then oftentimes it is going to be about brand. But it can also be about employee retention, right? Like as more and more people care about these things personally, when we became a B Corp, it mattered. The team members cared, right? And they were excited about it and they were more motivated. And there is literature out there that shows that that's the case. So actually standing for something as a company can, have a positive ROI in terms of retention, engagement, and recruiting. I think that a lot of this stuff is tough, right? Ultimately, you're going to have a leader who is personally invested in these issues, who will kind of, can use some of this data as an argument for why to do these types of things. Or you'll have someone who doesn't really care and then it's not going to get done. So I do think there are areas where a lot of this winds up being kind of, what do people care about at the executive level for personal reasons, and then how does that permeate throughout the company?
And what was your biggest source of motivation? What kept you going?
I mean, startups are exciting, right? It's like you're trying to make an impact. You're trying to do something that people tell you can't be done, and you've thought about it hard enough, and you've played around with things, and you've got some secrets. You've figured something out that you think is going to make this thing work, which does not exist in the world. And that's tremendously exciting. And hopefully it's going to impact, thousands, hundreds of thousands, hopefully, of users. They're going to have a great experience based on something you dreamt up in your mind. That is incredibly exciting. And so I think that's what keeps you going. And then once you're in it, you're in it, right? You've hired people, they're working for you. You have investors that have expectations about, what needs to happen. And so there's a lot of inertia that is going to keep you through like some of the harder low points. And the reality is also that it's very easy for founders to become so identified with their company that you couldn't even imagine doing something else or backing off. And so that's a reality of being a founder as well, which has its own set of consequences. But all of those things have been true for me.
Amazing. And was there a piece of like learning or advice that kind of stuck with you along the way, and which was it's called impact for you?
Again, I'm always going to come back to this learning loop. Is like make sure that you are being honest with yourself when you're like in your room at night and it's on a Saturday and you have a chance to take a breath. Like what are you ignoring? Is there a problem in your personal life or in your startup that you are avoiding grappling with? Because it almost certainly is going to be worse over time if you don't like deal with it up front. Even if it doesn't seem like it has to be dealt with then, and it's like, oh, I know how to get through this, being disciplined about like really tackling it early is a good practice and a habit to get into. And so I'd say that.
Amazing. And I guess for you, like personally, in terms of your vision or dream for the future, like what would you like to see in terms of like business or personal, like?
Yeah, I think a lot about tools for thought. Folks can get really excited about technology, raw technology, and that's awesome. I also get excited about it. But I think if we look at the larger problems, at least in the developed world that we're trying to sort out right now, it's a lot of the meaning-making institutions that we've been accustomed to be influenced by throughout the course of human history have started to fall apart. Right? We don't have monolithic religions in a sense that kind of like define meaning for people and give them roles in societies in the way that they used to. Even a sense of kind of like nationalism is not alive in the way that it once was. There isn't this kind of coherent narrative that helps tell people what to do and how to do it. Globalization makes it even more complex in that you're kind of competing with everyone for a particular job. And so I think a lot about what are the ways in which we can start to architect new structures of meaning that people can plug into to feel like their lives are important and to feel like they are pursuing some type of goal that is worthwhile. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs are drawn to that vocation because entrepreneurship is kind of inherently meaningful, right? You're doing something important, it feels important, it's hard, it could have a big impact if it's successful in ways that I don't think that you can get working at a larger company per se. But that's also part of the reason why that's true is because these other meaning making institutions aren't there to kind of provide meaning for folks in the same way. So I'm very interested in that. What does that look like as we kind of try to create something new that works in this technology-enabled world, where we can have folks that kind of like are able to cohere around a set of values, and more importantly, stories that communicate a set of values that give them meaning for their lives and allow them to shape kind of the trajectory of their careers and personal choices. So that's what I'm most interested in.
Amazing.
Awesome, folks. I'm going to have to jump, but it's been great to spend some time with you. And Michael, great to see your face as always. And hopefully this has been somewhat useful.
Thank you so much, Michael, and looking forward to see you and speak with you soon.
Take care, folks.